So in the future, our cars, our homes, and just about anything else could possibly be powered by some type of seaweed. Yes, it's true. And so to talk about inspiring research, I'd like to introduce Scott Lindell. He's a biologist and research specialist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. He's joining us via Skype. Scott, how are you doing this afternoon?
Very good, Molly. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much for joining us today. So this is actually pretty exciting. The Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution was awarded a large amount of money to do this research. It's from the Mariner program, which is Macroalgae Research Inspiring Novel Energy Resources. So we'll call it Mariner for short. That's what it's called. Talk to me just a little bit. We'll start very broad and then we'll really narrow in here. Talk to me just a little bit about what you'll be doing for this program.
Well, the Mariner program is really trying to harness some of the best research institutions in the U.S. looking at our future energy needs for the nation. And we as a nation have a huge amount of open water, what's called our exclusive economic zone, 200 miles from our shore. And we're really growing hardly anything in those waters compared to what our potential is. And energy sources, we're looking at all different options as a country and as a global population. Seaweeds have a lot of embedded stored energy in their tissues, just the way land plants do. And so our goal is to develop tools along with other collaborators around the nation. Our particular project that's been funded is here at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution that I lead, is to breed better strains of sugar kettle, a particular species that's popular for eating and has been for some time, but breed it in a way that it produces high amount of sugar that can be turned into ethanol and to be used as a fuel.
That's absolutely fascinating. So you'll be working on breeding these different specific types of sugar kelp and harvesting that. Tell me a little bit about the logistics of this. How is it going to work? Will it be in a lab? Will it be out in the open ocean? How is it all going to work?
Well, it's a combination of careful laboratory work in the early going, but ultimately the rubber hits the road when we plant a farm in the ocean. So we have several different grants that are all moving along at different paces and different times. This fall, a project I am involved in will put out a small plot of seaweed in the middle of Nantucket Sound as a basis for understanding the engineering involved in trying to grow sugar kelp in the open ocean, where there are terrific forces that we need to understand in terms of the stresses on lines and ropes and anchors. So that's part one, figuring out how to basically keep something stable in the water that can grow sugar kelp and not get torn apart. Then step two is to put the advanced and selectively bred strains of kelp. We developed those basically from surveying the wild with a variety of different strains that we'll collect up in Maine and some down here in Massachusetts and some as far south as Connecticut. And we'll breed those in the lab and then plant them all side by side, just the way you might, a home gardener might plant different varieties of tomatoes side by side, and then we'll decide which ones suit the bill for producing biofuels or human foods best.
I find this absolutely fascinating. There's so many ways that you can look at this type of research. We've spoken with people here on Go Local Live about harvesting sea vegetables for consumption. And now we're talking about this. You just mentioned you think about it in terms of a garden, which will be best, which type of sea kelp would be best for what type of different consumption, whether it be fuel or whether it be fuel. I find this absolutely fascinating research. When you look at a project like this, when you look at a program like this, when you look at research like this, do you look at the possibilities to be endless? And what do you see for the future? Do you try to keep it totally scientific, or do you get pretty excited when you have these possibilities?
Well, I get quite emotional when I think about the difference technologies like this could make for my kids and my grandkids. We have an ever increasing warming planet, and the oceans especially, and it's partly because of our reliance on fossil fuels. We really need to develop this next generation of carbon neutral fuels to try to postpone or hopefully forestall any further warming of our oceans beyond what nature's capable of supporting. So I think this is part and parcel of a really key, important step in our farming the oceans to really save the rest of the planet.
My goodness. So how will it work when you're looking at the sugar kelp? When you're looking at that, how in turn, when you're looking at this, growing this, see how it works, how can it then be taken, harvested, and then turned into some type of fuel?
Sure. So I'll just walk you quickly through the large steps. The seed that will breed, typically we breed it from the wild, but we'll now be selecting it from cultivars that we'll keep in the lab. But the nursery process for growing seaweed seed is typically done on an on-land hatchery. We can do it in our laboratory, but companies can do it in aquaria in their facilities too. That takes place typically between October and November, and then the seed is planted out in mid-November, say. That's planted on lines that are horizontally suspended in the water, typically about 10 feet from the surface, so most boats and traffic can go right over it. And then in the spring, come May or even, typically the month of May in southern New England, the kelp is fully mature to a market size of each blade is 6 to 10 feet long, so it grows quite fast in just 6 or 8 months, so 6 or 7 months. So it grows faster than corn or sugarcane, some of the fastest growing land plants in terms of biomass accumulation. Wow. So then that product gets harvested, typically within a 3 to 4 week time period, and it would go into be transported to fermentation plants where there's a hydrolysis step that sort of breaks down all that seaweed material into a liquid slurry that breaks open most of the cells so that all the sugar content is soluble. And then that goes into a fermentation step that then produces the ethanol that we might add to our gas tank. As probably people probably realize, when you're going to the pump, 10% of the petroleum that you're putting into your gas tank or the gasoline, that's ethanol, and most of that's from land-based biofuels currently.
So let's take a look at this from a different perspective, from an economic perspective. Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, or not Vermont, but New Hampshire, Maine, but think of these New England states along coastal waters. Could harvesting sea kelp, harvesting sea vegetables, seaweeds, could this provide a new type of economy moving forward into the future if this becomes a new means, a new wave for resources?
Oh, certainly. I think this could be much bigger than the aquaculture economy we've seen grow here in southern New England and throughout New England, in fact, with the oyster economy. I'm sure you've talked to oysters, and they created quite a buzz in the foodie culture world as well as the aquaculture world. And I think we'll see something similar, especially when we get to the scale that seaweed can become a real contributor to biofuels. There could be thousands of jobs. Our working waterfronts could be revitalized, to replace some of the declining fisheries. One of the things that we're really interested in studying, along with the research of the larger scale seaweed farming, is could these seaweed farms actually help become help replenish fish by new nurseries. We know that kelp beds and any kind of structure in the water tends to be places where little fish can hide and grow and then be part of the fishery. So there may be some opportunities for restoring and improving our waters and the fisheries with seaweed farms as well.
It seems like a no-lose situation. You're giving back into the ocean, and the ocean will give back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. One other thing to consider is that if seaweed biofuels begin to replace land-based biofuels like corn, those lands could be better utilized to produce food for people. That's going to be a growing concern in the next 30 years as we have 10 billion mouths to feed on this planet. The land crops are typically more palatable to our Western taste buds. And corn gets a considerable subsidy now to the farmers for growing it for biofuels, even though it's really not very energy efficient, given that there's a lot of nitrogen that's very energy intensive that needs to be put on cornfields. They hog a lot of fresh water, taking up a lot of arable land. Seaweed have none of those drawbacks.
It's absolutely fascinating to see what you're doing. Just as we kind of wrap up here, Scott, what's kind of the timeline here? Because you'll do your research. Are we looking at this is a 5-year research project, 3 years, 10 years, 15 years? What do you think the timeline is for the research to be done, and then if things do take off, implementation of possibly seeing sea kelp beds throughout New England?
Yeah, well, so let's start with the research program that's been recently awarded. It will formally start in January, and it's a 3-year project.
Okay.
We'll have at least 2 good selection cycles to produce improved cultivars. We hope that at a minimum they'll grow 20% faster than the typical wild cultivar now, but we may get lucky and produce something even much faster. We're hoping that after those 3 years, this and the other projects that are basically demonstrating the suitability of large-scale seaweed farming, that will attract investment, and that at the 4 through 10-year period, we'll see seaweed farming gradually grow to the extent that it will become then commercially viable for producing biofuels, not just food that it does now, but food, animal feeds, and then bio. That's the way we see the market growing.
Absolutely fascinating. Well, it's so great to talk with you today. We really appreciate your time, and congratulations. I have to say that there's been 2 grants awarded to Woods Hole there. One of your colleagues will be working with you as well, sending down. How about you explain it? How you're actually going to monitor?
I have a colleague, Aaron. Yeah, I have a colleague, Aaron Fischel, who's an engineer, very bright young engineer, who will be leading a project to use autonomous underwater vehicles to monitor these seaweed farms, save a lot of man hours otherwise spent out on the water trying to understand what the environment is around the farms, how fast seaweed is growing, when's the optimum time to harvest it. These are all questions that her technology will help us understand, and particularly at this early going, it'll be really interesting to compare our measurements when we go out in the field and weigh, measure blades, and what she can detect with this autonomous camera and sonar and water detection system that she's building.
It's absolutely fascinating. Well, I hope that we can keep in touch and you'll continue to update us on your research. I'm really looking forward to it. Always great work being done there at Woods Hole. So I really appreciate your time speaking with us today.
Great, Molly. Yeah, we'll be harvesting something next spring, so we can talk then.
Perfect.